Hi, this is Lori Moilov with the Limitless podcast, and I'm excited to have a very special guest here today. His name is Eric Mark, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He's an actor, writer, voiceover artist, also stand-up comedian. He was born and raised in Toronto, and he studied computer science and minored in drama. And with his pursuit, he was in entertainment and did entertainment consulting for some of the largest firms. And I know, Eric, you can tell me a little bit more about some of that consulting and strategizing
Sure,
for some of these
absolutely.
big firms. Like, let us know and some of the listeners.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Lori. Thanks for having me on the show. Good
Yeah,
afternoon. I've had the pleasure of knowing Lori for several years and working on her on a little project called Amplify, which we will elaborate on at some future date. But thank you for bringing up my Canadianism because today is Canadian Thanksgiving. So happy
right?
Thanksgiving to
Yeah.
everyone out there who celebrates or who shares the values of our
So,
nation.
so what's your favorite dish that you
Canadian
love?
dish?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, these are, Canadian cuisine, sort of a melange of things from so many other places. But I will say, I was back in Canada for the first time since the pandemic began a month ago for my birthday. And I will tell you this before even going to anyone's home, when my mom picked me up at the airport, before going anywhere, we went straight to like a Jewish deli so we could get like corned beef on rye. So
Oh,
that
that
is
sounds
certainly one
so
of my
good.
favorite things. And I think that LA thinks it's got some good delis. There's some half decent stuff. There's Langers and things like that. But the
Yeah, no,
reality is,
good.
doesn't compare to obviously not New York or Montreal or Toronto. And so corned beef on rye, extra fatty. My other favorite thing, my mom's version of corned beef and cabbage. So if people want insights on who I am, just think of the corned beef.
That's amazing. So, Eric, I know you kind of started. You started in computer science and consulting. And the interesting thing for me, I guess, knowing you as a friend too,
Yeah.
is that you came from a place of strategy and numbers and understanding those and being able to take big picture things but also add creativity to that, and being that you're now in the landscape of acting, which is kind of taking that spark. How did you, I guess I want to know, and I think what would be helpful for the listeners is how you made that transition,
Sure,
to
sure,
choosing
absolutely.
a creative lifestyle and being creative.
And I wouldn't even say it was a transition. I would say it was an
Okay.
evolution. So it's just like
Mhm.
I've always enjoyed these different pursuits, and I'm going to backstep a little bit to say that in our current somewhat troubled, well, troubled's too strong word, but our sometimes challenging times,
Mhm.
one of the things that's really dismaying to me, and which I think is part of the root of our problems, is just the distrust, the animosity, the vitriol that people throw at one another, and I think that, as opposed to doing that, it's why don't we embrace people for their differences? And I know that's,
Yeah.
it's a trite thing to say, but I mean in a very real sense. I think that, fortunately, we've entered an era also where diversity is revered, where suddenly, in the workplace, certainly in entertainment, everywhere else, people talk about diversity and hiring, whether it's across gender or race or
Hmm.
orientation or disability, wherever have you. I think those things are fantastic, obviously, and I think we need to continue to pursue that. But we should have been here 100 years ago. I mean, women had the
Yeah.
right to vote for 100 years in the U.S., and yet we're still talking about women's rights. The
Mhm.
emancipation of the blacks was in the 1860s, and we're still having people being shot on the street, which is just heinous, and so it's
Yeah.
not to diminish
Yeah.
those things. We need to be attacking those things every single day. But it's to say that, okay, we know that we need that kind of diversity. We also need two other kinds of diversity, I think. And one is, diversity of thought. And that's almost yeah, all of these pieces, the types of traditional diversity we talk to lead to this. But it's,
Mhm.
it's looking at other people and saying, not only are you not a bad person because you think differently from me, that's a good thing. And that's how we
Yeah.
both learn. That's how we both improve the world and the lot for all of the people in it. Um, and the other one is, and it comes back to what your question was, diversity within oneself. And I don't think any of us really think about that enough. It's the notion of being well-rounded, and it's saying that I can have multiple interests. I can be good at many things, or not good at many things, but doing many different things, and and enjoying, pursuing, and being, embracing those aspects of who I am. And we we sort of admire the notion of being well-rounded, but we don't really focus on it that much. It used to be for college apps, everyone wanted to make sure, okay, well, I'm excelling in school, I'm doing this community service, I'm doing this sport, but it was all about, trying to get ahead. Suddenly, by the way, I hear from a lot of people who have college-age kids the opposite. Everyone's being told, focus, focus, focus. Like, don't say you're good at all of these different things, because that makes the admissions people think, okay, well, you're spreading yourself too thin. No, absolutely not. I reject that. Do as many things as you possibly can. Embrace as many points of view, and hang out with. Right now you see a lot of politicians and people saying, and as we see some of these tragedies unfold on television, hang out with people who are different from you. Hang out with people who look different from you. And I'm like, why do we need to be told that? I mean, it
Yeah.
never occurred
It
to
should
me
be just
for one.
natural, like a natural instinct of, you want to learn as much about every culture, every
Yeah,
aspect and corner, because I think that's what, like you're saying, should be embraced. And I think that's really where creativity stems from, because we get inspired
exactly.
from each other, you know?
Yeah. I always say it's the worst world I can imagine is the one where everyone thinks and acts just like me, and to which
Yeah.
my mom responds, well, especially like you. But beyond that, the point really is not only saying that diversity is good, in the cliche sense. It's saying that I seek out things that are different from me. I think I seek out people who have experiences, who have points of view. And it doesn't mean that you agree with everybody else. In fact, quite often you're not going to, but that's fine. I think we make the mistake sometimes too, and what makes it difficult, everyone's like, well, you've got to respect everyone's opinions. That's not true either. You've got to respect everyone's right to have an opinion.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean if their opinion is heinous, you should just respect it. But even if it is heinous, you should try to understand it. And I think that that's what helps us build upon
Yeah.
our understanding of one another and work together and work through some of the issues that we have. Um, in terms of my own diversity within myself, yeah. So it was interesting. I was always good at maths and sciences, but I was also always good at writing and all those things. But I mean, the funny thing is, I came from one of those unusual families of Asian descent where we put athletics ahead of academics. So my dad, at a time when it was much more difficult, was like a champion boxer in college. He did a few other sports. He reveres my sister because she's a national team gymnast, and so that was really where a lot of the focus was.
Mhm.
Now I should caveat that there was an assumption we were going to do well academically in school, but it
Mhm.
wasn't really pushed. It was just like, yeah, I mean, it wasn't this notion that, okay, we've got to force our, it's just like withhold food or love or affection because you're not doing well in school. Like, we're going to do that because we feel it's important to ourselves, my siblings and I. But we did a lot. So I was like the captain of the cross country team, captain of the track team in the swim team in high school, and ran track and things like that. Because I enjoyed it and because I wanted to and because I like to excel at those types of things. But even with, and this was an important lesson, from my folks, even with my sister, so being at the highest level of athletic performance, and seeing a lot of her colleagues in cases where they'd come second or third in national or international meets, and their parents would be yelling at them, "Why didn't you come first?" And they'd be crying. My parents were the opposite there, and it's terrible. I mean, and we see it like in high level sports still, and you see it on the sidelines in soccer games or gymnastics, but you also see it at the very elite levels too. And that a lot of these people are being, it's not they're being pushed too hard, because I think you should be pushed hard, but you should push yourself hard because you
Yeah.
want to. And that was the lesson that came from my folks, was that they said to my sister all the time, you should be doing this for you, not for us. So it's not living vicariously through our children. It's like you do it because you enjoy it and you want to excel. And the moment that you don't, then you stop doing it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
said, don't take that decision lightly. Don't just quit gym because you don't feel good that day. Make sure that it's the choice you want to make. But she embraced that, and she ended up doing very well and going to the world championships and that kind of thing. And
Wow.
so it was good, and good for me to see. I never was at that level, but I was a pretty high performance athlete. And later in my consulting years, I've worked with groups like the U.S. Olympic Committee and things like that, and worked on their
Mhm.
strategic planning. So it's
Wow.
always good to be immersed in and to see that type of performance. But for me, so athletics was important, academics were important, friends were important, having fun was important. Um, and that sounds like it flies in the face of this notion of being focused. It doesn't mean I wasn't focused. It meant that I embraced all of those things. I prioritized some things more highly than others, and chose to do well, or as well as I could, at the ones that were important to me and most important. Now, I also learned another interesting lesson from my dad at that time. Like one day, I was sweeping the kitchen floor, and this sounds like some 1700s type of stuff. Well, back in the day when I was sweeping the kitchen floor, when we didn't have a Zumba or a Roomba, my dad says to me, and he grabs the broom and he goes, Eric, if you're going to do anything, do the best job you can. And so he grabs it and he starts sweeping vociferously. Years later, when we were talking about careers and where we were in life, and him in his older life, me in sort of like, a stage where I'm consulting and thinking about doing more creative stuff. I said, Dad, I got to say, one of the things that sort of inspired me was this story, back when I was sweeping and you grabbed the broom from me and said, whatever you do the best you can. He goes, I said that? That doesn't sound like something I would say. And I'm like, that's like one of my definitional origin stories. And he goes, I don't think that came from me. So, 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 so I kind of grew up in a sitcom environment, which may or may not have helped, who I am and what I've become. I will say, just in terms of the original origin story, and I think you know this, Lori. My full name is actually kind of funny. Eric Mark. People already talk about how sounds like two first names. Other people have said, if you like, is that like your SAG name? Is that like an actor name, Eric Mark? And I'm like, no, that's my real name. And I go, but my actual, what my dad wanted to name was crazier. My dad wanted to name me Mark because he thought that would be hilarious. Fortunately, my mom has more common sense and vetoed that. Yeah. And so my dad, unlike his son, not a big drinker, when I am born, goes out, celebrates, has a few drinks, puts a birth announcement in the local newspaper, the Globe and Mail for you in Toronto, or Canada, and comes back to the hospital, and my mom and the nurses ask him what he named me, or put, as the birth announcement. Yeah. And he can't remember because he's drunk, because he's not a big drinker. So they literally have to wait till it comes out in the paper the next day, and my entire name is Eric George Curtis Mark, so which shocks like the most waspy name one could possibly have, and my mom's stunned. She's like, why did you give him all these names? And my dad says, well, we talked about all these names. And my dad, who had a deeper voice than I do, by the way, and my mom's like, yeah, but we're going to give him one of those names, and like a family name is a middle name, which is what all my siblings have. Like, these Anglo names, Adrian, Colin, Jillian, but middle names that are family names, or in a couple of their cases, my parents' names. Mine are literally four waspy names that don't mean anything. So yeah, I grew up in a household that in that sense was going to generate creativity, because I will say this, like, I think from the stories you're hearing already, my dad, fantastic guy, super nice, super caring, very accomplished, an eccentric, obviously, and I obviously am as well. And in fact, it was pretty funny growing up. People would always compare, like in my late teens and forward, people would compare us. So, you two are like so much alike, which we both took as an insult. But in his latter years, we both came to realize not only was it an insult, it was true and a compliment to both of us. So I grew to appreciate that a lot more. And but it did help, I'll say, in one big way, which is the notion of peer pressure and talking about diversity and being different and everything else. And especially right now in this moment where we're seeing, the effect of social media and what it's doing to people, particularly girls, but to boys as well. And I think it's sometimes less talked about. I don't want to say I wasn't affected by peer pressure, but I was much less affected by peer pressure because I didn't care. In fact, if I cared, it was the opposite. I wanted to be different from everyone else, from a very young age. And I wanted to know that I was not doing what everybody else was doing, that I was not acting or looking or dressing like everybody else, that I was always going to be my own person. And I think it's a difficult lesson, or it's an easy lesson, but it's a hard one to execute sometimes. In my case, I genuinely didn't want to be like other people, so it made it easier.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of saying is, with this diversity of thought, it's really an inclusive strategy, right? And having that inclusive approach. And it kind of reminds me a lot of a time when I went to a panel with Ava DuVernay and Oprah, and they were talking about diversity, but they were saying, diversity, they'd rather it be inclusive because then everyone is involved. And so I think with creativity, it takes a team sometimes to build, the momentum and things that you want to see within this like idea. Now, my question is, when you kind of are focusing, like being that we're all about limitless creativity and we want to have that diversity of thought and that expansion, what are some of the ways that you do that with your own practices? I know that when you transitioned more into the creative space, you did it because you kind of saw, here's a landscape that doesn't feel that way and I want to be that change agent. I guess being that change agent, like you've produced, a film, some of these things. So how have you taken action with your creativity, to be that change that you're wanting to see?
There's a lot of things, Lori, and I kind of do it on both sides of the notion of one, explicitly seeking diversity in all the forms we've talked, and two, not seeking it at all, which sounds a little counterintuitive,
Yeah.
because what I really want is a world where it doesn't matter, where diversity of gender, race, orientation, etc., just is what we're used to, and no one
Yeah.
even comments on it because it's the norm. But I also want that with diversity of thought. So on one, that's the goal. And this is gonna, this is gonna make some people irritated, but it's taboo these days to say you're colorblind. Now, granted, that's usually pointed at white males for saying things like that, and people think it means that they're being dismissive of the issue. But I am. I mean, I don't notice race as the first thing I notice when I meet somebody. In fact, I don't notice it as anything. Like, and so many times, just given our experiences and then the continued demographics, particularly in business, I'd be in a room full of white males, or and although in entertainment, more and more white females as well,
Hmm.
for like 3 hours before it even occurred to me I happen to be the only person of color to use the PC word.
Hmm.
Um, because I don't care. I do care that we have to move towards more diversity, and I do care that where people are systematically holding people out, we should be doing something about it.
Yeah.
But I don't care what someone's race is. I don't, that's not who a person is, and I don't want to be judged on my race either. I don't want
Yeah.
I want people to make zero assumptions about me because of my race. You can make tons of assumptions of me because I'm Canadian, because I live in Los Angeles, because
Hmm.
I've got crazy long COVID hair. All those things are fair because those are all choices. My
Hmm.
race is irrelevant,
Yeah.
and I think that so when I say colorblind, I mean, and again, some people hate that word, but I mean
Yeah.
it in a very positive sense, And again, doesn't mean we shouldn't be just like I was talking about before. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be attacking and fixing the issues, or at least addressing the issues we have in the world. But it
Hmm.
means recognizing those and moving to starting to look forward to where we can and in my mind ought to be.
Tell these stories. What do you recommend for them? Like, if they're like, I have this story inside of me and I got to do it. I guess, what are some of your suggestions as a fellow creative that has worked for you?
Sure. Well, I'll actually circle back to Jessica's story just
Mm.
quickly because she's a great example of someone who just started writing on her own, did the hard work to get into a writer's room, which is the best way if you want to write for TV or film. That's
Yeah,
where a lot of
that's the
and
best
most of the
way.
showrunners of big shows today started out in something else. Like, I mean, I talked to Vince Gilligan at length once, who created Breaking Bad among other things, and he was a longtime X Files writer. So
Hmm.
was Frank Spotnix, who did um, uh, Nazis and Japanese won the war, and Amazon show based on a short story. Any case,
Is it the
anyway,
High
anyway,
Castle? The Man in the High Castle? Okay,
Castle,
there you
yes,
go.
yes. Cousin Pete happened to be in as well, but yeah. So writers' room is the best thing. Jessica's case is just this amazing success story. So Silicon Valley, writers' room. So just it's you barely get a credit, but you're in there.
Yeah.
You're learning for everyone else, and you're seeing how everyone else is at, and it's a pressure cooker, as anyone who's done that job or been a writer's
Hmm.
assistant knows. Went on to be a Rick and Morty writer, and one of the things that surprised a lot of people is that most of the writers for Rick and Morty were women as well. And turned out to be the Emmy award-winning one. She won the Emmy for the famous Pickle Rick episode,
Wow.
which most people who watch Rick and Morty, a lot of people say is their favorite, and based on that, ended up getting the She-Hulk writing gig. But for people at an earlier stage than that, or who don't have
Yeah.
access to that type of thing, um, as some of your other guests have said, part of it is just being creative and doing it yourself, and knowing that every day you've got to be doing this. It's if part, we talked about transitioning or evolving from consulting into doing more creative, partly because of the shape of the industry and wanting to make some of the changes. But part of it was that I realized after trying to do it the other way that to really be creative is, for the most part, a full-time job. You can do things on the side, but it takes years for most. You like
Yeah.
writers especially try to do that. But if you're serious about it, particularly if you're not writing a novel, but you're writing like a pilot or a screenplay or something else like that,
Hmm.
um, you really need to have some focus and dedication. And again, this is coming from the person who said you should be diverse, but some jobs are not that conducive to it. I mean, consulting's like an 80-hour a week job, and that doesn't count the travel. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's a big effort. I saw a casting director a while ago who said to a group of people, she was doing a talk, that in this day and age, this wasn't always true, but even to be an quote actor, if you're not making your own content, I don't consider you an actor. And when you're coming in to audition for
Wow.
me, it doesn't say, you're producing your own YouTube content or writing stuff or writing for someone else or writing or acting in someone else's shorts. Then you've given yourself a huge step down because I don't really consider you an actor. You're not doing what everyone, and that's cost of entry. And same for anyone else doing, any other type of creative endeavors. And
So
so I have
would
a
you
lot of
say
friends who are.
it's kind of like Issa Rae? You kind of, as an actor or actress, you have to kind of be that Issa Rae. You have to have a YouTube channel, or you have to have a little bit of momentum in the content space.
I wouldn't say you have to, but I would say it's a really good idea. And at the
Okay.
very least, if you don't have your own YouTube, by the way, you should have your own YouTube channel. But if you don't, at least be acting and stuff on other people's YouTube channels and things like that. And I mean, it's unlikely that you're going to break huge based on that, but you need that as a calling card. You need to be showing, and you need to be constantly working. And it's um, one of the things that fascinates me is another cousin of mine has been very successful, is a legitimate YouTube star and TikTok star,
Mhm.
coming from a completely different background. So he went to
Yeah.
McGill, one of the more prominent universities in Canada, in biochemistry. When he graduated, he expected, like most biochemists, he'd end up working in a lab, like either for a company or for the government or something.
Mm.
Decided he was going to do some videos, like some YouTube videos, just mainly for fun, a little bit to potentially pay a bit of the way, but he didn't expect to make any money on that.
Mhm.
Um, it blew up. I mean, high school teachers embraced them, kids embraced them. He now his handle is Nile Red. He has
Mhm.
almost 4 million YouTube subscribers, almost 4 million TikTok subscribers.
Wow.
One of his videos has 38 million views. Tons of his videos have over 10 million views. Um, I've talked to our friends, contemporaries of like people anywhere from their 20s to 40s,
Mhm.
and I've said, hey, and I mentioned I have a cousin who's done really well, and they're like, oh, well, what's his name? I'm like, Now Red, and they go, oh, I watch his stuff all the time. So I mean, for him, I think the target demo is sort of like teens to 20s, but he's getting people across the board. It's kind of
Yeah.
amazing, and it's blown up so successfully that his mom and his brother work for him full time. He built a studio from he was renting space before. He built a studio from the ground up that's a studio slash lab, like a working
Wow.
chemistry. Yeah, it's kind of amazing, right? So I mean,
It
talk
is.
about just unleashing your creativity, and and
Mhm.
and um, this isn't how people in the entertainment arts move ahead necessarily, but it does show you that by being, in his case, different, as we've been saying all along,
Mhm.
and using the channel well, presenting
Mhm.
himself, and in his case being a bit rigorous, learning what a good cadence for new videos is, doing them professionally, making them look good, even though he's super, like, other Eric, a friend of Laurie's and mine,
Yeah.
said, "Wow, he who knows Nigel pretty well, goes, man, he's so much geekier on camera than it is in real life." But that's his identity. That's what he's using
Yeah.
as part of the pitch. I mean, he's
Mhm.
he's he's Bill Nye for the 2021 crowd,
Mhm.
and it's kind of amazing. So
Yeah.
there are those avenues, and then other people, you have gone out and done this for one thing. You do all the music, you self-produce things, you put stuff out. I have friends who act, write, produce, direct. There's now. I will caution that sometimes there's too much. Sometimes if someone is better at some portions of those than you are, Why not use them?
Yeah.
And that's a mistake people have made, for millennia in business as well as anything else. You don't have to do everything. What you need is to have access to everything, whether it's you or someone else. And so I would concentrate in that sense on the things that you're better at because you're going to get a better product in the end, probably. Now there's people, I mean, there's the Woody Allens, the Clint Eastwoods, and the handful of folks who can do it all and can do it well. They're fewer and farther between. Do you know Dave Wakeling from the English Beat once said that his when they released Tears of a Clown, the cover song, and it did really well. His dad told him that's what you should have been doing all along. He said his dad said to him, "The Beatles wrecked music," and he's like, "What are you talking about? The Beatles were the greatest thing that ever happened to music. Certainly to pop music in the 20th century."
Yeah.
And he's going, "Yeah, but the Beatles made everyone think that they have to be writers, songwriter, performers.
Yeah.
Those separate métiers. It doesn't mean people shouldn't do it if you have the ability,
Yeah.
but a lot of people don't. Like being good at writing songs has very little to do with being good at performing songs. And if you happen to be good at one of those but not both, let the person who's good at it do the other.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting comment and an interesting way. Again, doesn't mean the people who are singer-songwriters are doing a bad job. It means if that's not who you are, though, why do it? And the father pointed out, back in the age when Burt Bacharach and stuff were writing songs, you had some great gems. You had just amazing songs coming out of the Brill Building in New York and things like that. And to some extent we've lost that a little bit, and it's an interesting point of view. Again, not to dismiss people who are we love the notion of multi-hyphenates now.
Yeah.
I and you are those, but again, try to do the things you do well. From that perspective.
Yeah.
I'm going to say one other panel I saw, this is a slightly different thought, but, as writers and people trying to do things, it's important to get work done, whether it's sold or good. Doing something is always better than not doing something. And so I had one of my writing coaches, Wendy Hammers, who's fantastic and does a salon from time to time in Santa Monica. She had a lot of students, in her weekly classes, we'd have to bring in sort of 6-minute pieces and read them. I'm the only person who wrote new stuff every week. Everyone else would take notes and then bring in the same thing. And it would get better over the course of 6 months. But isn't it nice to have something now at the end of 6 months, their thing's much more polished than my thing is after 1 week. But I know what the critiques of the thing after 1 week are, and I know I can make it better. But why don't I try to have something else, And so as a result, I ended up writing hundreds of pieces, whereas other people came out with 6, and Wendy extends it to the notion of even first drafts of if it's a book, a memoir, a screenplay, whatever else. Finish the first draft. Stop revising the first act and finish the first draft. Even if it's terrible, at least you can say I've got the first draft and now I'm rewriting it. And it's a really, really interesting lesson because it gives you a sense of accomplishment and moving forward that you don't have otherwise. And we can tie that to the broader world as well. So, one of the other principles I live by is on top of this notion of diversity in the broadest sense, perspective. And so many people lack it. I mean, it's part of what causes the lack of diversity of thought and the pushback. But it's even some of the smartest people I know, some of the nicest people I know, some of my closest friends. They look at the world, even pre-COVID, and even pre the last president, and say, we live in the worst of times, the conflict in the Middle East, people blowing each other up, Somalia, literally piracy going on, Afghanistan, all of these things, famine, drought, and I'm like, you have no understanding of where we've come from. Yes, all those things are terrible, and yes, we should be working every day to address those challenges. But things were so much worse. A generation before us, everyone grew up literally thinking they were going to get annihilated from a nuclear Armageddon. Literally thinking that, and that's why we see the vestiges from time to time of some of the nuclear fallout shelters and things like that. People thought there would be no notion of peace in the Middle East. And, the fact that we even got to some Arab countries recognize Israel and things like that. Are we where we need to be? No, not at all. But the fact that we were part of the way there, we're so much better off than we were. People thought that the conflict in Northern Ireland would go on forever. And the biggest of all is no one thought the Soviet Union would ever fall. Like, we thought Cold War was the future of mankind. And so it's, not recognizing those things. The problem with that isn't that we should forget that there's problems today, because there are. There's huge problems. But it's if we forget that we can overcome challenges, if we forget that we can make progress, we won't ever do it again. I mean, people forget that 60 years ago, black people couldn't ride in the front of the bus in this country. That the so-called Old West is barely 100 years ago, and people shooting themselves, in the streets in New Mexico and the High Plains. That, and almost as maybe more important than all these things, very few people had any type of education. Like, it's not that you and I are geniuses, but we could not have had this conversation, not because we're not smart enough, but because we didn't have any information or any means of learning anything. And that alone, the fact that I would, I don't know what the number is, but let's say that there's 700 million people in the world, 10% of the world, who has the means to be educated, to talk to one another, to learn from one another, means we're infinitely better off than we were, say, 60 years ago.
And speaking about infinite and limitless, I want to touch on, just what I've kind of gained from our conversation, which is really having that diversity of thought, just being expansive and infinite with connecting and sharing and learning from each other. That's kind of what I've gained from you today, Eric. And I'm just really thankful to have you as a guest because, yes, I think there's a lot of growth and opportunity for expansion. And the only way to do it is to have these conversations and continue the conversations and keep including a vast array of people so we can keep learning. And so I'm just thankful to have you here on the Limitless podcast. And is there any one last creative statement that you would like to add, Eric?
Yeah. No, well, first, thank you so much for having me, Laura. A fantastic time here and great having this conversation. I hope that it was useful to you and to your listeners. I will add, one more comment on top of the learnings we've had, which are around diversity and perspective, and the notion of completing your first draft, like
completion, right?
To that last notion, just one more elaboration. I had the privilege of seeing at the Paley Center once, the Radio Television Museum, a panel with some of the great television writers of a generation ago. So late Gary Shandling, Phil Rosenthal, J.J. Abrams, Judd Apatow, and so as you can imagine, great discussion. Some of the guys who've created some of the most amazing television and gone on to do some of the most amazing, big movies and things since then. But during the Q&A, someone said to them, "Hey, you guys are all writing for TV, and you have deadlines. That's so difficult. I mean, how do you fight writer's block?" And one of them laughed, and it wasn't in a dismissive way. It was more of I can't. And he literally said, "That's the difference between a professional and an amateur." And again, that can sound dismissive, but it wasn't meant in that sense. It was meant in the sense that we have to get our show in, our script in by Friday, and if we don't, we're fired. And that's all there is to it. And so, what it means is sometimes you have to compromise. Sometimes it's not your best stuff. Sometimes it's like stuff you don't even want out there, but you've got to do it. So to the notion of completeness and everything else and finishing things, sometimes it's better to just get it done. And that was such a huge lesson to me, because I, like every writer who's ever been, claims to get writer's block sometimes. Mm-hmm. He and then other writers I've since then have said there's really no such thing as writer's block. It's all up to you. It's all about how much you want to push through it or not. The biggest thing I learned was time management, and it's that in the end of the day, you can't do everything. And again, this is coming from someone who said you should be diverse and have many interests and do many things. You have to learn how to prioritize those. Doesn't mean you should put any by the wayside. Sometimes you have to, but it doesn't mean you have to. It means know what's most important, know what has to get done first, and make sure you do those things. But so be as broad as you can, but be as focused within that breadth.
Wow. That's a perfect way to end today with Limitless Podcast. Is all about, focus, put it together, think diverse and inclusive, and just be creative, right? So thank you so much, Eric, for joining the Limitless Podcast. And I look forward to you all tuning in to the next amazing podcast. Thanks so much. Thanks, Eric.
freak with.